banks of a cold southern river, there was no battle cry, no final charge, just a single man, weighed down in steel, stumbling through the mud in the dead of night. No one was chasing him, no sword was drawn against him. Yet he ran like a king fleeing from a nightmare that only he could see. His armor groaned with every desperate step. And then came the river, wide, black, moving fast. He tried to cross. The weight dragged him down, one splash, then silence. No rescue, no body recovered, only whispers. A crown lost beneath the current. A king drowned, not in glory, but in shame. His name was Louis II of Anjou, a man who thought he was chosen by God, crowned by the Pope, and destined to rule Naples. But what he found wasn't a throne, it was betrayal, hunger, abandonment, and a watery grave that would remember him longer than his people ever would. Louis's story doesn't begin with drowning. It begins with a promise made in the halls of Avignon, where a pope chose him not for virtue, but for politics. And from that moment, the fall had already begun. He wasn't born for this. Not to rule, not to conquer, not to carry a crown forged in other men's wars. Louis of Anjou entered the world as a second son, pampered, political, a symbol more than a soldier. But when the French court and the Avignon papacy locked eyes on Naples, they didn't need a warrior. They needed a vessel, someone young, impressionable, noble by name, and empty enough inside to fill with their ambition. Louis became that vessel. And he believed. They told him he was chosen, that God himself, through the Pope, had marked him as king. And Louis, barely a teenager, believed that too. The old king of Naples, Queen Joanna, was painted as a heretic. The Pope declared her deposed. Louis was handed a sword and a title, and before he could understand the weight of either, he was on a horse, riding toward Italy with holy banners flapping in the wind and steel on his shoulders. He had never seen Naples, never fought a real battle, but they called him king. The French nobles kissed his ring, and in the back of his mind, Louis began to think he was more than just a tool. Maybe he really was chosen. Maybe his blood was enough. But no one told him what Naples truly was, a fractured land soaked in betrayals, where thrones weren't inherited. They were taken by the blade and lost the moment you blinked. What Louis carried into Italy wasn't destiny. It was an illusion polished so bright, it blinded him to every crack underneath. He didn't know it yet, but he was already walking the path of a king who would never be king. And once his boots touched Neapolitan soil, the earth began to shift, quietly, dangerously, underneath the weight of his borrowed crown. The first time he marched into Naples, he didn't ride like a king, he floated. The city didn't fall through violence. It opened, as if waiting for him, as if the heavens had already cleared the way. Louis entered with the papal blessing carved into his banners, and for a brief moment the illusion held. Bells rang, nobles knelt. The Pope's emissaries whispered, "Behold, the rightful king." And Louis, only 16, sat on a throne that was never meant to last. But thrones built by others crack in silence. The people didn't love him. They feared him, or worse, they saw nothing at all. To them, he was another foreign hand reaching for their necks. His soldiers, French tongues, foreign boots, cold stares, patrolled streets they didn't understand. Gold drained from coffers faster than it came. And Louis, who thought the crown would grant him power, found himself surrounded by whispers he couldn't trace, and loyalties he couldn't command. He issued decrees no one followed. He smiled through ceremonies no one respected. The court of Naples, carved by blood and betrayal long before he arrived, did not bend, it watched, waiting, testing. Then came the first revolt, small, distant, but sharp like a needle-piercing fabric. Louis sent men. The rebellion returned with fire. Villages closed their gates. Roads turned hostile. And the people, once silent, began to murmur Joanna's name again. She was dead, but her memory burned hotter than Louis's living breath. The Pope urged him to stay firm. You are king by divine right. But Louis began to feel the truth bleeding in around the edges. He wasn't king. He was a boy wrapped in armor too big for his body, surrounded by men who smiled with knives behind their teeth. And still he stayed, because kings don't run, because the lie had sunk too deep into his bones, because stepping down meant waking up. And Louis, still floating on the ghost of a crown, would rather break than open his eyes. But Italy does not forgive illusions, and beneath the weight of his silence, the city began to rot. Power doesn't always shatter, it seeps away, drop by drop, until a king wakes up drowning in a throne no one believes in. By the time Louis realized Naples was slipping through his fingers, it was already too late to hold it. The courtiers who once flattered him now sent letters behind his back. The soldiers who once rode beside him now eyed the exits. The coin ran thin, the wine turned sour. And the crown, once radiant under the Neapolitan sun, began to weigh heavier than steel. The rebellion was no longer a whisper. It was a shape forming in the dark. Cities began to close their gates not out of fear, but disdain. The name Louis no longer opened doors, it curdled the air. His enemies multiplied not because they were powerful, but because he was not. He had become what every king dreads, visible weakness. And in the medieval world, weakness doesn't invite pity, it summons the knife. So Louis fled, not with banners, not with fanfare, not even with dignity. He left Naples like a shadow, retreating north with what was left of his army, tired men, unpaid, hungry, diseased. The roads stretched ahead like veins bleeding out into the hills, and behind him, the kingdom closed like a wound that never belonged to him. The city he once ruled sang no farewell, no elegy, no hate, just absence. But the story should have ended there. A failed king retreating into obscurity, a prince who tried and fell. History should have let him rot in exile, forgotten like so many others. Yet Louis returned. Years later, drawn by ghosts, ambition, or something darker, something broken. Because sometimes a man doesn't learn from drowning. Sometimes he walks back toward the river. He came back not as a king, but as a ghost wearing the same crown. Years had passed since his first fall, but Louis returned to Naples as if the land would forget, as if betrayal, hunger, and silence could be rewritten by stubbornness. This time there were no celebrations, no bells, no open gates. The people remembered him not with hatred, but with indifference, and in many ways that was worse. The army he brought was smaller, stitched together with promises and borrowed loyalty. Mercenaries, desperate nobles, broken men chasing a dream that had already drowned once. But Louis believed, or needed to believe, because if he wasn't king, then what was left of him? His youth had rotted in the name of this crown. His soul had cracked on its behalf. There was no version of Louis without Naples, just armor and guilt. He set up camp outside the city, waiting for a miracle. But miracles don't come twice to men who waste the first. The Pope, once his father in faith, had turned his eyes elsewhere. France, busy with its own bleeding, sent no gold. Winter crept down from the hills like a curse. And Louis, still draped in royal silk, watched as men died around him, some from cold, some from infection, and some from the realization that this king had brought them here to rot. One night a captain vanished with a third of the food, another with half the horses. By week's end, Louis had fewer men than he had regrets, but still he didn't run. He paced, praying to a God who no longer answered, clutching the hilt of a sword that had never drawn real power. Inside the city, his enemies laughed behind stone walls. Outside, his camp decayed into a graveyard without names. And Louis remained at the center, regal in posture, hollow in purpose, waiting for a tide that would never rise. But tides do come, just not the ones you ask for. When the flood finally came, it wasn't water, it was silence. One by one, the tents disappeared. Fires went out. Men vanished into the woods under moonlight, never to return. No horns sounded, no last oaths. Louis woke each morning to fewer faces, fewer footsteps, fewer reasons to believe. And still he stayed. Not because he thought he would win, but because there was nowhere left to run that wouldn't echo with his failure. The nobles who remained did so out of fear or debt. They sat in cold circles, speaking in half-words and glancing sideways when Louis entered the room. No one said it, but everyone felt it. This campaign was dead, and the man leading it was not far behind. Food became ritual, stale bread, water that froze before dawn. Horses lay stiff in the snow, unburied. Even the wind stopped howling, as if the land itself had turned away from him. Then came word. An enemy force approached from the south, not an army, not even a threat, just enough to shatter the illusion that Louis was still in control. There would be no siege, no final stand, just dissolution. Louis ordered retreat. But this wasn't retreat, it was collapse disguised in orders. What followed wasn't a march, it was an exodus. Soldiers without boots, nobles wrapped in curtains, clergy shivering under broken canopies. They moved like ghosts, trudging through frozen mud, following a man who once called himself king. Some say Louis grew quieter with each step. Others say he stopped speaking altogether. No prayers, no commands. Just a vacant stare fixed on the horizon where no sanctuary waited. The rivers ahead were swollen from weeks of rain, churning like veins under the skin of a dying world. One crossing stood between him and escape. Just one. And that's where it happened. The river didn't roar, it whispered. Cold and swollen from winter rains, it stretched across their path like a wound carved into the land. Louis stood at its edge, his armor clinging to him like rusted gilt, his breath visible in the morning dark. Behind him, the remnants of his army waited, silent, shivering, barely human. No one moved, no one spoke, because everyone knew this wasn't just a crossing, this was the end of something. He went first. Some said he insisted, that he refused help, that even then he still clung to the posture of a king. Others claimed he simply walked, numb and wordless, into the current like a man stepping into confession. The river rose fast around his knees, then his waist, then higher. His armor, once a symbol of power, turned on him, dragging, locking, pulling him under with each step. The current didn't care for bloodlines or titles. It gripped like judgment. Halfway across, he slipped. There was no scream, just the sound of steel breaking the surface, then silence. A few men rushed forward, but none followed him in. They watched. That's all they did. They watched their king disappear beneath the grey water without a single order, without a final prayer. And in that moment, Louis became exactly what the world had always suspected, an empty shell crowned by others, swallowed by something far more real than he had ever been. The water closed over him, and he did not rise. What remained on the far bank wasn't a kingdom, it wasn't even a funeral, it was a void, waiting to be filled with rumors, shame, and eventually, forgetfulness. But before silence took him completely, the current carried one final message to the men he left behind. You followed a man into nothing. The king was gone, but no one said the words. They kept marching, as if movement might erase the truth. A few men muttered prayers. Others looked back toward the river, then quickly away. His body never surfaced. His sword was never found. There was no crown to recover, only the absence where a man used to stand. What remained of his army limped northward, splintered and silent. No banner flew, no songs were sung. They passed through villages that didn't open their gates, through forests that seemed to close behind them. One by one, they drifted apart, some to mercenary bands, some to death, some to nothing. Louis had led them into a ghost campaign. And now they were the ghosts it left behind. Back in Naples, the city barely stirred. The rumors arrived before the corpses. A drowned king, a retreat turned rout, a failed crusade for a crown that never truly belonged. No bells tolled. No effigies burned. The court did not debate his legacy. They simply moved on. France said nothing. The Pope said less. Louis's name faded like breath in winter air. His allies erased him politely, carefully. Not out of malice, but discomfort. Because to speak of him was to remember that the divine right they'd invoked had sunk in a river and dragged 100 men with it. But in certain corners of Italy, in taverns too quiet and back streets too narrow, the story endured. Not of Louis the king, but of the man in the armor who walked into the river and never came out. Some swore he'd been cursed. Others believed he drowned long before he ever set foot in the water. Either way, they all agreed on one thing. A real king does not vanish like that. He drowned, but it wasn't the water that killed him. That had come long before, the day he believed that being chosen made him untouchable, that crowns granted weight without consequence. Louis II of Anjou wasn't destroyed in a river. He was hollowed out slowly, piece by piece, by a dream too heavy for the boy who carried it. The world never carved his name into stone. No monument marks where he fell. His legacy wasn't erased. It was quietly folded away, like a garment no longer worn. The House of Anjou would speak of other sons. The church would sanctify new wars. And Naples. Naples would remember him only as a shadow that passed through once, left no roots, and drowned before morning. But history keeps strange echoes, and for those who listen close enough, Louis remains a warning. Not of failure in battle, but of the far colder death that comes when a man builds himself from the outside in. His armor outlived him. His crown outshone him. He became a symbol before he ever became a man, and when that symbol collapsed, there was nothing beneath it to save. He was not the only one. A century before, a boy named Conradin was led to a scaffold in the same kingdom Louis tried to rule, beheaded before he came of age, executed for a crown he barely touched. And in another kingdom, across the sea, the Black Prince wasted away in agony, never allowed to wear the crown he won in blood. Some men die in fire, some in war, and some, like Louis, simply vanish, pulled into the quiet by the weight of a throne that was never truly theirs. A king without a kingdom, a crown without a legacy, and a death without witness. Louis II of Anjou didn't fall in battle, didn't burn on the pyre, didn't blade on the steps of a throne. He disappeared, quietly, shamefully, beneath the surface of a river that remembered everything his people chose to forget. His story is not a tragedy of blood. It is a tragedy of emptiness, but he was not alone. Watch the story of Conradin, the boy king executed in the very land Louis tried to claim, whose head fell beneath a foreign sword while a city watched in silence. And see the fate of the Black Prince, the warrior who conquered half of France, only to rot away in pain before the crown could ever touch his brow. If you want more forgotten kings, lost heirs, and royal downfalls drowned by time, subscribe to the channel, and don't miss the next story already waiting in the shadows.